Today, here in Sharm el-Sheikh, we established the first ever dedicated fund for loss and damage, a fund that has been so long in the making.
Decades in the making, an agreement to compensate developing countries for damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions. In today's show, we ask whether COP27 did enough to save our planet and our future. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Hong-yuan, former Minister of the Interior, National Taiwan University Professor of Hydraulic Engineering, expert in environmental disasters and disaster prevention, and Helen Hai-ning Huang, Li Senior Associate, practice in corporate and investment and energy law. She's also a Harvard graduate in environmental and climate law and policy. And our political editor, Huang, speaks to Taiwan Disaster Industry Association President, Weather Risk Explore founder and CEO. Minister Li and Helen, a very warm welcome to the show today. So, Minister Li, after weeks of wrangling at COP27 and 2 days of overtime, they finally agreed a historic loss and damage fund.
Yes.
Now, the details of who will pay and how much have been deferred to next year, but is this still a historic achievement?
Yeah, at least, although most of the rich countries they admit we should take responsibility for the global climate change. But I would say actually they cannot make any conclusion, have to leave it to COP28. It's a little bit disappointed. And also, actually, the amount, I just keep wondering, how much money is enough? Because we are talking about all the disaster caused by extreme weather condition, all the damage from not even the poor country, the rich countries is also been damaged. Actually, we are talking about a lot of money, and who can afford, and who is willing to pay, and then we have to discuss then what is the fully developed country? Is China a fully developed country or not? Because rich country or developed country should take more responsibility. But the Chinese government will say, no, we are a developing country. We should not take that much responsibility. So that's, I would say, yes, at least we admit we should take responsibility. But then how, who, how much, we have to split among so-called rich countries, and who should receive among those developing countries. So I would say there's a long way to go. At least make one progress.
Helen, in your practice of law, these are the sorts of issues that you discuss and that you work out. How do you think the fund might work? How might they begin to work out how much payment calculated from the damage?
Right. So it's very, very difficult, but something can be distinguished here is that the loss and damage that we discussed during the COP27 is not identical to the actual monetary loss and damage as we discussed in the context of legal world. So the loss and damage here we are referring to, in a broader sense, the negative consequences of the impact of climate change to humanity and also to the natural system. So it doesn't mean, it's not necessarily the calculation of the actual damage in the monetary sense. It's actually the scale of the damage and the damage prevention, where those vulnerable countries really need funding from rich countries. So the narrative sort of bit changed during COP27 is that people no longer talking about monetary compensation or reparations. Instead, they are talking about solidarity, hoping that the rich countries can contribute funding to the poor countries and countries with more vulnerability.
So how is that different to the $100 billion that was agreed in previous COPs? Is this going to be a similar mechanism?
Right, it's very difficult that how do we distinguish the existing funds and the new fund. So a possible direction is that we define very clearly an element and criteria for this new loss and damage fund that can where the working group can try to distinguish the existing fund and the new fund. based on their different purpose.
Minister Lee, so moving from a thorny issue of this financing, climate financing, to basically the looking at the symptoms itself of climate change. Many environmentalists were disappointed that there was no agreement on either phasing out, phasing down fossil fuels. How does this either move us forwards or backwards, in your view, from COP26?
Yes, actually, with the greenhouse gas, actually the fossil fuel actually is a major contributors. But there are so many profit involved. So actually, a lot of countries, especially the rich country, they refuse to put fossil fuel into the item. I think that's a little bit disappointed. But actually, from the Ukraine war, from the current situation in EU, you can say there's no choice. But I would say yes, we are moving, but I would say a little bit too slow.
It's interesting you bring up Ukraine, because there had been the view that Ukraine could, accelerate the shift to green energy. So what you're actually saying is
no, actually it's drawback because of there's not enough the natural gas for the EU, so they had to move back to the very original way of getting heat. So the cold, because it's in Europe, it's very cold now. And the electricity is very expensive, so they have to use coal. And also in Taiwan, yes, we believe we can get rid of the nuclear power, but actually it's not feasible. Then we don't have enough natural gas, then we have to go back to coal. So that means actually it's a very complicated situation. But I want to point out, now people just talking about money. I compensate you. But how to spend the money? Who's going to spend the money? So I will say that another more important things never be mentioned in COP27 or any protocol is the capacity building. Those developing countries, they receive the money. Then how can they design? How can they execute the money? And also the corruption is also an important factor, never been mentioned. So money is one thing, and to come to the implementation, the sides, that means who is going to control, who is going to evaluate. So I would say there's still a long way to go.
It's a very complex issue.
Very complicated situation.
Helen, COP26 had the phasing down of coal, but not phasing out. And COP27, tell me about what they wanted to do.
Right. I totally agree with the minister that, well, the US and the EU bloc, they try really hard to push the wording phase out of all fossil fuels being included in the final tax, and by leveraging the energy chaos caused by Russia. And many activists actually assert that this now is a critical window that we speed up the ship away of fossil fuels. But the outcome is quite opposite. Actually, the language actually inserted in the final text is just a copy and paste from COP26. There's no progress on a more aggressive wording using to urge the nations to phase out fossil fuels, especially because of the strong opposition from the pro state and fossil fuel producing nations. And there's a big trade-off between phasing out of coal and other fossil fuels and loss and damage. These two issues are so intertwined during the COP27.
Okay, well, to conclude this segment, I want to ask you both, was COP27 more a success or more of a failure? But before, so that you've got time to think about your answers, let's go to two sound bites from delegates on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh. First, EU Climate Policy Chief Frans Timmermans. Let's take a look.
But I urge you to acknowledge, when you walk out of this room, that we have all fallen short in actions to avoid and minimize loss and damage. We should have done much more. Our citizens expect us to lead. That means far more rapidly reduce emissions. That's how you limit climate change, not wait and respond once the climate change has done is devastating effect.
And then COP27 President Sameh Shoukry, let's take a look at what he's got to say.
It was my objective and intention, and I believe I succeeded in avoiding that any of the parties were to backslide. And we did make it absolutely clear that what was achieved in Glasgow would be the foundation. And that was a bottom line. But we recognize that there have been indications of a disappointment in certain quarters who had a higher degree of ambition. But that disappointment, I think, should be put in context.
Minister Lee, should more ambition, the desire for more ambition, the disappointment, should be put into context?
Yeah. I think everybody agrees. Yes, they do have some progress, but still even a lot of disappointments. So I would say it will make COP28 even more difficult. Yeah.
And COP27, success or failure?
I would say 50-50.
50-50, that's very generous. Helen, how about you, 50-50?
I think it's a big success for loss and damage issue because this has been advocated for more than 30 years. But it's really a big blow to keep 1.5 alive. And I think nations, parties need to work together within the institution of UNFCCC and also outside of UNFCCC, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally, in any way.
Okay, so we need to deal with the symptoms rather than just tackling we need to deal with the causes rather than just tackling the symptoms.
Yeah.
Okay. Still to come in the show, Taiwan is excluded from the COP gathering due to pressure from China. But where is Taiwan placed when it comes to mitigating climate change? But first, great power rivalry is spilling over into climate change. The US has taken the brunt of activists' anger despite John Kerry's attempts to redirect blame onto China in his closing speech. Minister Lee, China produces 30% of the world's emissions. That's more than any other country. Yeah. But it also produces more solar and wind power and electric vehicles than other countries. Could you assess China's record, its performance at the moment for us? And is it a strong argument that they are the manufacturing hub of the whole world and therefore should be allowed to produce more emissions?
Actually, of course, you're talking about a lump sum. They're the largest, is for sure, because they have 1.4 billion people. So of course, they are the factory of the world at the current situation. So, and then again, Chinese will say, we are a developing country. You should give us more room for improvement. So that's one thing. And then actually in year 2000, at that time, China was still developing. And there's a dilemma we discussed. If Chinese should learn the way of American lives, actually 4 resources of the earth can provide one China. And after 20 years, it really come true. So this is 30% of carbon dioxide is just because of that. So I would say China should, they should take more responsibility, but for them, it's a little bit difficult because their situation, they're developing, and the city and the suburban area is very different. The poverty is also a major challenge for the country. So this country has so many things happening simultaneously. And then you can ask them, say, you should follow the protocol according to European or the America. In fact, actually, it's not really fair. But we should discuss with China, say, yes, the fact is you produce 30% of the carbon dioxide, and can you come out with a solid plan to reduce it? So I would say this is a long discussion, long dialogue. But I would say from Chinese point of view, at least from the message I receive, they are really take these things very seriously. We hope they really can reduce their carbon dioxide. But I think they keep keep claiming they are developing country, they should have more room.
Yeah, on that topic, Helen, let's go into this subject. They are part of the G77, classed as developing countries, the global south. Is that fair?
States, nations, they define themselves whether they are developing countries or not. It's at their own discretion. But
really?
Yeah, but on certain issues, for example, loss and damage.
So sorry, on that process, is that a fair process? That is, it depends on how they describe themselves.
It's really hard for others to set a objective standard to determine whether a state or a nation is actually become a developed state or not.
So GDP per capita, these are not the sort of things that are being used.
These are available and trustable indicators, but overall, it's upon state to decide whether they are developed countries or not. So China obviously is using this discretion to define themselves as a developing state. And on certain issues, for example, the loss and damage, as we discussed before, this is really, really problematic. Because on the one hand, China is the world's largest emitter. On the other hand, developing country or least developed countries with tiny emissions sided with this biggest polluter to negotiate with other wealthy nations on loss and damage. And as a developing country, China might get funding and might receive funding from the new loss and damage fund. That's not fair.
The world will be paying it to emit, and there's also no incentive on its part to reduce its emissions. Because it doesn't need to pay out and it's actually receiving. Right,
that's why the US and EU bloc tried really hard to, on the one hand, preventing China from receiving money, on the other hand, to ask China to do more to cut their emissions.
Minister Li, let's go to the US now. So Joe Biden made a brief visit to COP27, and in his speech he talked about wanting to, or being back in a leadership role in climate change. Let's take a look now at a soundbite from his speech.
Proving that good climate policy is good economic policy. It's a strong foundation for durable, resilient, inclusive economic growth. It's driving progress in the private sector. It's driving progress around the world. And the sum total of the actions my administration is taking puts the United States on track to achieve our Paris Agreement goal of reducing emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030.
Minister, a reduction of 52% by 2030, that's pretty good, isn't it?
It's very ambitious. Actually, at least President Biden admit the United States should do more. But from my understanding, I know about America, actually, they want to reduce their carbon dioxide. They have to totally change the way of our American living style. They cannot just drive, they need railroad, they need a lot of infrastructure to invest. And that takes time, and they take money. So I would say, yes, it's a very ambitious goal, but I think America needs help. Because they are not familiar with the railroad system.
Oh, help from where?
Help from, unfortunately, China. They are the most capable country building the railroad and high-speed rail.
So those two big countries to extend to the US, the Belt and Road infrastructure project to extend to the US.
So those two big countries, that to discuss with them, they are the largest and the second largest carbon dioxide resources. They should take much more responsibility than the rest of the world.
That's a fascinating idea, Minister. So that's the US at home. US overseas, however, US has poured more than $9 billion US dollars into oil and gas projects in Africa. What do you make of this?
So actually, they are put money in Africa for them to reduce carbon dioxide?
Basically oil and gas plants for African.
Yes, and that means they are going to produce carbon dioxide.
But in Africa.
That's in Africa, so the quota is not in America. So actually, when we talk about the carbon footprint, so we should talk about the whole lifespans. So actually, okay, I don't cut the trees, but I consume the Indonesians' trees. Who should take the blame? So I would say, of course, we have to track all the carbon footprint. So I reduce the carbon dioxide in my own country, but I generate the other carbon dioxide in the other country. How we are going to calculate that? So I was from right beginning. I say this is an ethical problem. It's not just a counting problem. It's not a technology problem. If the Americans say yes, I want to reduce carbon dioxide, then they should say, then we should not consume some Africans' carbon dioxide. We should also control that.
Helen, on that ethics issue that Minister raised, according to Oxfam, the richest 125 people, including Jeff Bezos, emit more carbon dioxide than the whole of France. Jeff Bezos' own 11-minute space trip emitted more than the poorest billion ever would in their entire lives. So just like the richest countries, is there, which Minister talked about, is there a bigger responsibility on the richest individuals to reduce their footprint?
Definitely. So there's a term recently called polluting elites. It accurately describes the situation as you mentioned. So, and under climate law, actually, there's a common but differentiated responsibility. Means that richer countries with historic emissions records should bear more obligations to cut their emissions and work with vulnerable countries to help them to transit to decarbonization economy.
So in conclusion, Minister, I want to ask you both, going back to the world's biggest emitters, are they as bad as each other in your view?
I mean,
China
and America. Well, I think that in fact, they produced most of the carbon dioxide. That's true. So I would say they should take much more responsibility to reduce the carbon dioxide in their country and outside their investments. They should take some responsibility about that. They should do much more than the rest of the world.
Helen, and in your view?
Right. I think to some extent, both of them are a bit hypocrite. Would you agree? So we really need these two countries to work together to reduce their emissions, because only when the U.S. and China reduce their carbon emissions can the global emission fall as we expected.
Are there any differences that you can see? Any main differences between these two? Is China, for example, trying harder? Or, obviously we know that the US is producing less than half of what China produces.
I think both of them work in their own way, but they really need to cooperate with each other. Yeah. They need to put cooperation before competition, because now we see there's competition before cooperation. But on climate issue, they really need to work together. They have their own way, their own policies, their own plannings, but they need to work together to make it possible.
Okay, thank you.
But I believe those two countries, they can really work together, come up with a conclusion, will make COP28 much easier.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, let's hope for COP28. Still to come in the show, our political editor, Huang, catches up with the president of the Taiwan Disaster Industry Association, who is fresh back from COP27. NGO Germanwatch released its annual climate change performance index ahead of COP27. The index tracks the climate protection performance of 59 countries and the EU, enabling comparison of these efforts and progress. The CCPI assesses each country's performance in 4 categories: cutting greenhouse gas emissions, using renewable energy, reducing energy use, and climate policy, which is the setting of targets to answer how well a country could achieve its Paris climate targets. Now, Denmark achieved the best 2023 ranking, followed by Sweden, Chile, Morocco, and India. Taiwan, however, placed near the bottom at 57th. Taiwan Talks reporter Hai-ning breaks down the figures.
According to the German Watch 2023 CCPI Index report, Taiwan was listed 57th among the 63 countries from the Climate Change Performance Index, upping one position from last year. Taiwan ranked 58 out of 63 for greenhouse gas emissions, while ranking 57 out of 63 for renewable energy, 54 out of 63 for energy use, and 42 out of 63 for climate policy. From 2005 to 2020, Taiwan's GDP has grown by 79% and greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced by 45% during the same period. This shows Taiwan grew its economy at the same time that it cut its emissions.
Helen, Taiwan rejects the German Watch ranking, and the EPA says that CCPI uses inconsistent methods and that Taiwan is on track to reach the net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It also goes on to say that standards don't account for Taiwanese industry structures and disregards the relative responsibilities of each country. What does this mean? What is the Taiwan government's response?
Right. Well, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if the calculation methods are really misleading or not. But as far as I know, the CCPI index is actually evaluate countries' climate performance based on their actual performance. So this ranking is really a signal for Taiwanese government that you need to do more. You can't just have policy and slogans. You have to implement your policy. You have to really perform your policy goals so as to make it real. So based on the actual performance, I think it is a very strong signal to Taiwanese government.
Minister Lee, so just kind of interpreting the rankings, Taiwan was best in the national determined contributions category, which is, the legally binding targets that each country must put forward to the UN. So it was best in this category, as Helen just mentioned, best in kind of talking about or setting the policy, the targets. Next best was reducing energy consumption. Then after that, using renewables. And then lastly, the actual cutting of emissions itself. What do you think about the targets that the government has set? Are they ambitious enough?
I would say, because I cannot really access to the number of the government, but from my understanding, I would say our government talk more, we do less. We say, yeah, we are going to reduce carbon dioxide, but we are not really, that's not an enforcement. For example, I have been a minister, and our EPA said we are going to reduce carbon dioxide to which year, to reduce how much. But you never say your ministry, you have to take care of 1 million tons of carbon dioxide in 2 years. You should give us the target. Then I say, according to the target, then I'll change the policy of my ministry. Then we really have the enforcement. So I would say our government just talk, but they really implement, because they are not. I would say they are hesitating. Is our electricity, our gasoline is among the cheapest in Asia, because we always compensate. Since you compensate, that's why our carbon footprint will be so high.
Because it encourages greater use from consumers.
Because the factory, they don't have the pressure to reduce their consumption of their oil and their electricity. But our government say we want to please people. So we maintain the low utility price. And that's the major cause of the high carbon footprint of Taiwan.
So, but is that something that also happened, perhaps when you were in government with the previous governments? Was it always kept?
All the government is the same, because we want to please people. We want to reduce the price of the utility, and there's a consequence of high carbon footprint, because those factories, they don't have incentive, they don't have pressure to reduce their carbon dioxide. And the government says, yes, you have to do that, but you have to come up with the law enforcement. You don't have the stick. So you would always compensate. Actually, there's the mindset of Taiwanese politicians. They always want to please people. But end up, that means now we have such a bad record. Actually, it's a very shameful record. Such a rich country, and we have such a high carbon footprint. So how can you tell people that we have something to offer? I just came back from Vietnam. So the countries get flooded, and meanwhile you say you should reduce your carbon dioxide. I don't have the heart to say that. They can barely solve their problem. And there are 80,000 Taiwanese factories now in Vietnam and consume their gas, using their electricity to produce carbon dioxide. I think our government should do much more from Taiwan, then help our business people all over the world to reduce the carbon dioxide. So starting from ourselves.
Right, yeah, just like the US we're talking about in Africa. Helen, however, Taiwan is a leader in Asia for offshore wind power generation. So did you feel that this was reflected in the German Watch report?
Yes, actually, as I remember, our ranking for renewable energy in current trend is pretty high. So we are ranked high, and I forgot, I'm not sure, perhaps ranked 25, 26 among the states. So this is a pretty good result. So in the long term, it seems that it assures that the government's policy on the promotion of renewable energy, including offshore wind, is the correct policy direction.
Well, Economy Minister Huang recently spoke to our political editor Huang, and she was defending Taiwan's green energy transition. Let's play a clip from that interview now.
那因为大家知道台湾面积很小，所以要怎么样有效的来增加这个绿电？从成熟的电这个绿电开始做，那另外也会再去开发，包括地热，包括碳捕捉回收，包括小水力等等，那这个也都会持续来做。那在这个绿电的开发上，特别是在离岸风电，我们有非常多的外国投资人来台湾投资这个离岸风电，特别是欧洲国家。那其实大家都会看得到，台湾的政府在发展这个相关的绿电的时候，其实是非常努力来解决各项问题。那各位如果去看其他的国家，不管是发展太阳光电或绿电，其实也都会碰到跟我们一样，它有非常多的行政程序要克服，然后还有很多的问题要去解决。那所以也都会提到要花非常多的时间。那台湾就是会第一个会跨政府间，常常跨政府间的合作，还有中央政府会跟地方政府来合作，来解决各式各样的问题，还有取得各式各样的执照。那所以很多的外国企业都提到，台湾的政府在执行这一些的绿电的时候的效率是很高的。不过因为台湾的制造业用电是很大量，所以我们绿电的开发这个一定还会持续。
Helen, how is Taiwan placed globally in this respect, in terms of wind power and in terms of what the minister just said, in terms of the the ability of countries to come here and to invest in green energy?
Right. So it's really at the beginning of the whole development is policy driven because we have very favorable feed-in tariff scheme, which means the government actually provide higher electricity price to renewable energy, so that you can actually earn more money from selling power to Thai power company here in Taiwan. Because of this policy initiative, the European companies, big energy giants, they are eyeing on Asian markets and consider Taiwan is a good place to make their first investment in Asia. And that's true because for many countries, Taiwan became their first hub in Asia to develop offshore wind. And they also bring technology, funding, and many professional experts to Taiwan for us to really expand our understanding to this industry.
Minister, from wind to water
Yeah.
and floods, which is your speciality, Greenpeace Taiwan warned in a 2021 report that if we get a 10-year flood in 2030, 17% of Taipei will go underwater.
Yes.
Previous to that, in a 2020 report, they talked about 4% of the country sinking by 2050. Can you help to explain these two scenarios? It seems like a huge difference.
Well, I don't know how they calculate based on which ground, because I did not calculate that. They are talking about extreme weather condition in Taiwan become normal. In one single typhoon, because Typhoon Morak, 2,000 years event, it will happen every 2,000 years. So every typhoon, we always say it's a 1,000-year event, but it just happens very frequently. So the water comes very strong, and also the sea level rise. So you are talking about if the sea level rise, it should raise 1 meter. That means without flood, the most of the Taipei will be flooded. So this is the consequence, the sea level rise and the more rainfall coming from upstream, and that happens simultaneously. And that in the past, we blindly believe we build a high dike, we can solve our problem. But in Taipei, we already spent 300 billion NT, even more than 300 billion NT, we still get flooded. That means that we have to change the way of, actually I keep promoting so-called non-structural measures. We should not believe that you spend money, we will solve the problem. No, we should redesign our city. We design the road, design our wetland, redesign the park, then we solve the flood problem. And this is non-structural measures. And also one thing is Taiwan, we never talk from this scale. We should seriously consider reallocate our capital from Taipei to Taichung. Because we simply have too many people in Taipei, and that's very vulnerable. So we should, from all kinds of measures to face the fact that Taipei will be sink pretty soon. In just matter of maybe 10 or 15 years, that will happen. So we should talk about structural measures, non-structural measures, even we should consider reallocate our capital.
Helen, do you agree? What do you think about relocating Taipei, or the capital, to Taichung? Can you talk about some of the regulatory measures that could help this decentralization?
Right. I totally agree with ministers about the redesign of our cities, and that's actually enshrined in many of our laws. For example, the Spatial Planning Act, which asks the government, both the central and local governments, to prescribe a spatial plan that must consider the adaptation of a city and the regions and must consider the vulnerable villages when they are planning their city and county. Also, others laws like Coastal Management Act or even Environmental Impact Assessment Act, these legal tools provides many opportunities for the government, the agencies, and also the private sectors to consider the adaptation issue, and so as to let us to prevent the future disasters.
These are tools that are currently being used, though. So, is there a reason why they're not being used in the way that you're talking about?
Sort of. It's all about implementations, because the tools have been enacted into the law, but it really depends on the government, the agencies, to use those tools.
Actually, the central government should realize this is really a crisis. But the problem is our government doesn't realize this is really a crisis. So we are talking about a flood. How about the drought? Actually, in central and southern Taiwan, we have already been facing very severe drought. Then we ask Taijideng, TSMC to go to Kaohsiung. That's impossible. There's no water there. But just That means when I used to work for the government, I mentioned it's a content. We should calculate our carrying capacity. Right. What is the right capacity for a city from south to central to north? Then we redesign our island, redesign our city according to our limitation. Right. If you don't do that, that actually that's the role of the central government. They should make the decision from that part. Then the city will follow. If they don't do, they did not lead this policy. Actually, the city government, they cannot do too much about that.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. Taiwan is excluded from participation in most international summits under pressure from the People's Republic of China. But while Taiwan doesn't participate in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, officially, delegations represent the nation in an unofficial capacity. Our political editor, Huang, sat down with Dr. Hai-ning, president of Taiwan Disaster Industry Association, who is also the founder and CEO of Weather Risk Explore, who has recently returned from Sharm el-Sheikh.
The damage from the extreme weather based on the climate change is from the developed countries. So they want $100 billion annually. And however, it's not easy. The first question is it's not easy to identify the real loss. Your loss and damage by the climate change is really from the climate change or not, or by your maybe your infrastructure is not good enough. Another big issue is because the economic situation is not good until now, especially in the recent year, and especially the Russia and Ukraine, the war. And so most of the developed countries also suffer the economy inflation. So such is kind of the situation. If we want the mitigation, net zero need money. Loss and damage need money. Which money is more important? So it's a major key point in this COP27. And I think the real reason is from China, because the China and US, they have some commitment about a collaboration about climate change. So China, before COP27, they always claim we should have a common and separate.
Dr. Peng, you talked about how these goals have not been met in large part because of China. Can you talk a bit about how China has its separate goals?
The growing emission of the China is very fast. So in the last 10 years, China is always the #1 emission in the world. And also the historical accumulated emission is also will become the #1. So I think in last 10 years, the China, their attitude, especially the global interest conflict about climate emissions changed a lot recently. And although their negotiator, especially their chief climate negotiator, Mr. Xie, is always the same one, but his attitude, especially his talking, is totally different. So right now, I think that China, because they still think about the G77, I mean the Africa country, they work together. And however, they switch to developed country because they promise they will donate 1 billion China dollars, renminbi, to donate to Africa country. It's a kind of the loss or damage. And however, some country claim it's a kind of fund for that. So China changed and however, it's also follow their 一带一路. They were just like a chain to develop some influence of the China in Africa. So I think it's a competition, especially the Africa or lots of developing country. China and US, they want to compete the political influence by the climate change issue, especially the donation.
Does a healthy relationship between the US and China benefit the world in terms of climate change?
Because they are the big two countries, if they can do more, and I think the global emission will be cut down as quick as they can.
Dr. Peng, being on the ground in Cairo at the COP27 meeting, how have you observed in terms of the international reaction to Taiwan's climate change issues, and in what areas can Taiwan both the government and corporations work to enhance Taiwan's soft power and help other developing nations?
What I feel is the COP27 right now changed to just like enterprise, the private sector. They can show what they did about the climate change. So lots of the event, the government will take their enterprise to be there to introduce to the global communities. So before that, the COP, just like the government official want to negotiate something. But until now, the COP changed to the government, private sector, all the private sector, they can show something to find some new opportunity because of climate change. So I think it's totally changed. And so I think the Taiwan, I recommend our government should continue to go back to the UNFCCC. Although we probably, it's not easy to be a party member, but we should be some observer from the government side. And the other side is for the private sector or NGO. I think it's open. So I think we can join more in the future, especially the private sector in Taiwan, especially in our ICT technology industry.
The EU has been consistent in terms of keeping its 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. How do you feel Taiwan can work with the EU, given that green energy has been largely in part with cooperation with the EU, as we've seen in Changhua and other places with wind energy, solar energy?
Yeah, right now Taiwan, the renewable energy development is very quick. Especially, I think it's the very good example for the EU, especially the offshore wind farm, renewable energy. They just choose Taiwan as a good example in Asia. So Taiwan is their export region, especially a hub in Asia right now. So I think, however, I remember I visited Denmark. Denmark is the CCPI. The CDPI is German Watch, the Climate Change Performance Index. The ranking is the number 4. Number 4 means the number 1 because they were no 1, 2, 3. So Denmark is the number 1 in the world. I found the Denmark because their government want to do the climate change, and also they developed a kind of the offshore wind farm, renewable energy industry. So they choose Taiwan as their good partner in Asia. So I think good linkage between the EU government level, especially the EU Commission level, Taiwan should work with EU directly. And also from the private sector, especially the renewable industry. I think for Taiwanese and company and also the EU renewable industry, we should link together. So it's a good opportunity for us.